Tonight, we begin with a development that Pentagon officials, NATO commanders, and White House advisors had warned about, monitored for weeks, and hoped would never come to this. A coordinated series of actions that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in 72 hours. 72 hours that upended Putin's entire operational timeline. 72 hours that exposed critical vulnerabilities in Russia's Western Front. 72 hours that forced the Kremlin into a reactive posture it has not faced since this war began. What Russia did this week crossed a line that Washington had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, speed, and overwhelming force. For several weeks now, there had been signals, not official Pentagon briefings, not formal intelligence reports, just signals that Russia was preparing something deeply concerning. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been predictable in his aggression. NATO observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his strategic posture. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by a single degree, every intelligence agency in the West pays attention. The warning issued by the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after National Security Council meeting described Russia's move as provocative, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, a direct challenge to the red lines Washington had established privately. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most decisive military actions we've seen in this entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of confirmation of Russia's repositioning, Ukraine launched a multi-domain offensive. These weren't the standard drone strikes we've seen before. These were deep penetration operations, advanced systems and tactics that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally reshape the battlefield. Tonight, Ukrainian military command confirmed that their forces launched precision strikes on at least 14 Russian military targets, including a command and control hub in occupied Crimea that had recently been reinforced with advanced air defense systems for what analysts believe was coordination of the repositioned assets. Ukraine struck before Russia could complete their operational setup. They hit fuel depots supplying forward positions. They hit communication nodes linking Russian units across the southern front. They hit logistics centers that were likely preparing to sustain an extended offensive operation. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's planned escalation, the infrastructure that would have made it operational. This is what made Washington's warning so urgent. Russia's repositioning wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could fundamentally alter the trajectory of this war if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't attack civilian areas. They didn't strike Russian territory in ways that would trigger Article 5 concerns. They hit military infrastructure. They hit operational capability. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence officials now believe that Russia's latest move was designed to test the cohesion of the Western alliance after months of political division over aid packages. Putin wanted to see whether NATO and its partners would fracture under pressure. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine and its allies didn't show cracks. They demonstrated a level of coordination that was so rapid, so comprehensive, that even Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, Kyiv did. Defense analysts speaking with Western media outlets under anonymity described Russia's shift as strategic probing, a way to identify weaknesses before a larger operation. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and unpredictable. Their strikes were not only effective, they were timed so precisely that Russian air defenses had less than 4 minutes of warning. That timing matters because it shows intelligence penetration that Russia clearly did not anticipate. It shows that Ukraine is not merely reacting to Russian moves. They are anticipating them. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian Air Force assets carried out over 40 sorties in a 6-hour window, forcing Russian air defenses to deplete critical missile stocks. Special operations units targeted a radar installation that had been upgraded in the last 3 weeks. Naval drones operating in the Black Sea reportedly destroyed or disabled 2 patrol vessels used by Russia to enforce their grain blockade. This wasn't just a counterattack. This wasn't just retaliation. This was strategic degradation. This was systematic disruption. And systematic disruption is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failed advance on Kyiv in 2022. For every territorial gain they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that undermines their ability to hold or exploit it. Remember, Putin thought NATO would splinter after the first winter of energy pressure. He thought Ukraine would negotiate from weakness by now. He thought Western weapons would stop flowing after domestic political battles. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. NATO is more unified than at any point since the Cold War. Ukraine is striking deeper and harder than ever before. Western weapons are not only flowing, they're being used with devastating effectiveness. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Russia's latest move happened at a time when Putin is under unprecedented domestic and international pressure. Military hardliners want total mobilization and nuclear threats. Economic advisors want de-escalation to ease sanctions. Regional governors want resources redirected to internal stability. His own security services want a victory they can actually claim. Putin is balancing these demands while casualties mount and the war drags into its 3rd year. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. Washington's formal statement, now circulating through diplomatic channels worldwide, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow Russian escalation to go unanswered. Senior officials said plainly that Russia's repositioning was inconsistent with any pathway toward de-escalation or negotiation. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and we're not going to let it work. You don't usually hear that tone from the State Department unless something serious is at stake. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed his nation and the world in a defiant, resolute speech tonight. He said, they wanted to test our will. They found it unbroken. He said, every missile they move, we see. Every plan they make, we counter. And he said, Ukraine does not wait for threats to become attacks. We act first. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the strategic repositioning, Belarus also increased military exercises along the northern border. Russian naval forces expanded patrol patterns in the Baltic. Pro-Kremlin hackers increased cyber attacks targeting NATO infrastructure in Eastern Europe. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing a major winter offensive before the ground freezes. Another is that Russia is attempting to create leverage before any potential peace negotiations. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to fracture Western support by demonstrating that escalation carries no consequences. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't seek approval through lengthy bureaucratic channels. They didn't telegraph their response days in advance. They struck hard, struck fast, and struck where it hurt most. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see whether the West will blink first. Ukraine wants to show that every escalation will be met with decisive response. Washington wants to prevent this conflict from spiraling beyond control, and Europe wants to prevent becoming the next target of Russian aggression. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials who are now analyzing satellite imagery of the strike aftermath. They say at least 9 of the 14 targets show significant damage. They say Russian forces are now repositioning defensively rather than offensively. And they say Russia's decision to move those strategic assets forward is likely part of a broader pattern of intimidation intended to weaken Western resolve before winter. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down. Their response today, rapid, precise, and devastating, sent a message to Moscow that escalation is a two-way street. And it sent a message to Washington and NATO that their investment in Ukrainian defense is paying dividends. As the situation develops, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve. But what we do know is that Washington's warning was timely. It coordinated allied response. It gave Ukraine the green light they needed. And it demonstrated that Western intelligence is tracking every Russian move in real time. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next 48 to 72 hours. If they back down and reposition defensively, this moment will be remembered as the day Putin's bluff was called. If they escalate further, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are ready and willing to respond in kind. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, Russia appears to be recalculating. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Moscow is quiet, it means they are reassessing. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Putin learned something he should have learned long ago. Ukraine will not be intimidated. The West will not be divided. And every escalation will be met with consequences. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The historic blow was delivered. The counterstrike was devastating. And the Kremlin is, for the first time in a very long time, stunned. And we will be here watching every detail as the next chapter unfolds. Tonight, we begin with a decision that Pentagon officials had feared, anticipated, and ultimately prepared for. A decision that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in a matter of hours. Hours that reshaped the battlefield, hours that rewrote the rules of engagement, hours that sent a message heard from Washington to Moscow. What Vladimir Putin did this week crossed a line that the Biden administration had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, the United States did not hesitate. They responded with speed, precision, and overwhelming coordination. For several weeks now, there had been signals, not official statements, not diplomatic cables, just signals that the Kremlin was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain rhythm, a predictability, almost a choreography. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military activity know the indicators. The troop rotations near the Ukrainian border, the naval movements in the Black Sea, the increased encrypted communications between Moscow and field commanders, the sudden repositioning of strategic assets. All of that went quiet. And whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Early Tuesday morning, U.S. intelligence officials detected what they described as unusual military posturing, including the movement of tactical systems that had not been deployed in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only mobilizes when they are signaling something very specific: escalation, provocation, or direct confrontation. American analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his strategic posture. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by a small degree, the National Security Council pays attention. The statement issued by the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior official, after classified briefing, described Putin's move as reckless, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, reversible only through immediate countermeasures. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most coordinated military operations we've seen in this entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of detecting Russia's repositioning, Ukraine launched a series of precision strikes. These weren't the standard drone attacks we've seen for months. These were deep strike operations, long-range capabilities that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to reshape the battlefield. Tonight, the Ukrainian armed forces confirmed that they launched precision strikes on Russian logistics hubs, including a command center in occupied territory that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was a planned offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate. They hit ammunition depots. They hit fuel reserves. They hit communication nodes that were likely preparing to coordinate a multi-front assault. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's planned operation, the infrastructure that would have made it operational. This is what made Washington's warning so urgent. Putin's repositioning wasn't just symbolic. It was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could fundamentally alter the war's trajectory if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike civilian areas. They didn't target population centers. They hit military infrastructure. They hit command and control. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. U.S. officials now believe that Putin's latest move was designed to test the resolve of the Western alliance after months of political uncertainty. Putin wanted to see whether Washington would waver. But instead, the opposite happened. The Biden administration didn't delay. They authorized an intelligence sharing operation that was so rapid, so comprehensive, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily. But today, Washington did. Defense analysts speaking with NBC News under anonymity described Putin's shift as probing behavior, a way to identify cracks in Western support. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and lethal. Their strikes were not only effective, they were calibrated so precisely that Russian forces had no time to relocate high-value assets. That timing matters because it shows real-time intelligence integration. It shows that Ukraine is not merely reacting to Russian aggression. They are anticipating it. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of the coordinated response. Ukrainian ground forces carried out targeted operations near Zaporizhzhia, forcing Russian units to fall back from forward positions. Naval drones targeted Russian vessels that had been repositioned in the last 48 hours. Cyber units operating from undisclosed locations reportedly disrupted communication networks used by Russian commanders to coordinate troop movements. This wasn't just defense. This wasn't just resistance. This was strategic initiative. This was battlefield momentum. And momentum is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failed assault on Kyiv. For every territorial advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that degrades Russia's ability to hold it. Remember, Putin thought Ukraine would fall in 3 days. He thought NATO would fracture under economic pressure. He thought the West would lose interest and move on to other crises. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is striking deeper than ever before. NATO is more unified than at any point since the Cold War. And Western support is not just continuing, it's accelerating. What makes this moment so critical and so volatile is that Putin's latest move happened at a time when he is under extraordinary domestic pressure. Russian military bloggers want faster results. Nationalist hardliners want total mobilization. Economic elites want sanctions relief. And ordinary Russians want their sons to come home. Putin is balancing these demands while fighting a war he cannot afford to lose. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The State Department statement, now circulating through diplomatic channels, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow Russia to escalate its way to victory. Officials said plainly that Putin's repositioning was inconsistent with any genuine interest in de-escalation. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and we will not let it stand. You don't usually hear that tone from Foggy Bottom unless something serious is at stake. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed his nation in a defiant, measured speech tonight. He said, "We will not be intimidated by those who mistake cruelty for strength." He said, "Every weapon they move, we will find. Every plan they make, we will disrupt." And he said, "Ukraine does not wait for permission to defend itself." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the military repositioning, Russian state media also launched a coordinated disinformation campaign targeting European audiences. Wagner-linked forces increased activity in Africa, stretching Western attention. Cyber operations increased attacks targeting NATO infrastructure. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Military analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing a new winter offensive. Another is that Putin is attempting to freeze the conflict in place before potential diplomatic talks. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to test whether he can escalate without consequence. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for approval. They didn't hesitate while committees debated. They didn't ask for permission. They acted. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Putin wants to see if the West will blink. Ukraine wants to show that they remain a formidable fighting force. NATO wants to prevent a broader European war. And Washington wants to prevent nuclear escalation while maintaining support for Kyiv. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are now monitoring Russian command channels. They say communications traffic has spiked dramatically. They say there are indications of confusion within Russian field units. And they say Putin's decision to reposition forces is likely part of a pressure campaign intended to fracture Western unity before winter. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is pressing their advantage. Their response today, swift, precise, and devastating, sent a message to Putin that escalation will be met with escalation. And it sent a message to Washington that their investment in Ukraine's defense is paying dividends. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve. But what we do know is that the American intelligence sharing operation was timely. It gave Ukraine the warning they needed. It enabled strikes that degraded Russian capabilities. And it demonstrated that the U.S.-Ukraine partnership remains operationally effective. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next 72 hours. If he de-escalates, this moment will be remembered as a failed gambit. If he doubles down, Ukraine and the United States have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Moscow is quiet. Too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is reassessing. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something he has learned many times before. Ukraine will not break. The West will not abandon them. And escalation is a game that two can play. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The United States made a move. Ukraine capitalized on it. And Russia is on the back foot. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.